Thanks for visiting the Australian Yowie Project's YouTube channel Cryptocast. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and share our content if you like what we do. Don't forget to click the bell for notifications every time we release new videos for you. Now, it's off to the podcast. Australian Yowie Project, Podcast 1, Episode 1. I'm on the phone with the bush ninja himself, Mr. Gary Opit. G'day, Gary.
Good morning, Ray.
How are you, my friend? It's been too long since we've spoken.
Yes, it's been a while. No, I'm very well, thank you.
Oh, that's good. And what have you been up to lately?
I haven't been doing terribly much because we're in the middle of this COVID-19 coronavirus epidemic, and so we're all isolating at home. Fortunately for my wife and I, Carmel, we have a 6 acre or 2.5 hectare property in the middle of 1,000 hectares of wilderness at Byron Bay by the beach, and so we're not stuck in an apartment. And I'm mainly involved in maintenance of the property and working on my books and accumulating information from listeners to my radio program on ABC North Coast Local Radio. A wildlife identification program that records species identifications from 40 to 50,000 listeners in northern New South Wales.
Yeah, that's right. I remember you've been doing that a long time with the ABC, and I can remember when you used to be on the ABC up here in Brisbane doing it, and people used to ring you up and say, "What's this sound, Gary?" And they'd give you this description, and you go, well, this is a 20-mouth frogmouth owl or something, 20 owl or whatever it may be. So, yeah, you've been doing it a long time, and, of course, you know, you've got the background of over, 35, 40 years as a working biologist doing everything from wildlife surveys to flora and fauna surveys to species identification, you name it, you've done it, huh?
Yes, that's right. My whole life and childhood, my greatest interest was the identification of plants and animals, and I've spent most of my life actually in the forests of Australia, New Guinea and Southeast Asia and the west coast of North America, doing fauna and flora surveys and ecological assessments. Most of those are in Australia and New Guinea, one in Malaysia, and I've lectured to universities and high schools on a number of subjects: microbiology, zoology, botany, ecology, geography, cosmology. I'm interested in all of the sciences, and my radio program for ABC North Coast Local Radio has been running weekly, live to air for 23 years.
Wow.
Began in 1997. And so over that time, I've received thousands of phone calls and emails with descriptions of animals, and I can identify every mammal, bird, reptile, amphibian or invertebrate.
Wow.
But of course, some with the invertebrates, in other words, the insects and spiders, arachnids, etc., and the mollusks and sea creatures. Often, of course, I need a photograph of it to work out what it is, and then I'll look up, send the photographs on to experts if it's some obscure species. But otherwise, if they're mammals and birds, reptiles, amphibians, I can generally tell people instantly what it is that they've encountered. And so we've identified about 400 different species of known classified animals, but I've also received hundreds of reports of several species of large mammal that are completely unknown and unclassified. And of course, they range from very large gorilla or hairy man-like animals down to unknown moles burrowing in the sand dunes. So, and of course, none of these reports conclusively prove that these exist, But because I have received so many reports from so many people, from so many different locations and at different times, then we can see a very clear pattern. And so it's very likely that people are actually encountering animals that do exist and that they're not hoax.
Well, I think the big thing, Gary, is people who are listening to these podcasts now that we're creating them and in isolation with not a lot to do necessarily. First of all, I would simply say you're supposed to have retired 10 years ago, and you're not exactly what I would call retired by any means with your work in nature that you still do and your wildlife work and also the cryptozoology work. But anyone listening to this podcast and the people listening to the podcast know that I've been an active field researcher for over 15 years and in this field of cryptozoology, if we want to call it that. You, of course, the body of your work speaks for itself and goes on for a very long time. The one thing I was thinking about this morning before you got on the phone, before I called you, you talk about, the multitude of reports. When I first got into this, I got into this for one reason, which was to answer a question, to try and answer the question. Did I see and did I experience what I thought I did? And if so, what are they? And what amazes me is, and since particularly we've got the Facebook groups, we've got the Australian Yowie project page, which has nearly got 1,000 people, and the group has almost got nearly 1,000 people, and our other page, Yowie Evidence, that it just never astounds me, never ceases to amaze me, I should say, the number of sightings, the historical, recent, potential encounters, not only in the remote sections of Australia and Papua New Guinea or in America with Bigfoot, but also close to the cities, close to the towns like where you are near Byron. I mean, the amount of reports from your area alone is staggering. The Central Coast reports are staggering. And of course, a lot of reports that I've heard and people I've spoken to from, out of north and out of northwest and western Brisbane.
Yes, that's right. The evidence, the anecdotal evidence for the existence of these animals, quite astounding. And of course, it provides evidence that they must definitely exist because various researchers, such as myself, never receive any reports of any mythological animals. Now, the majority of the population, of course, are city dwellers, watching all kinds of movies and TV series, and there's all kinds of mythological monsters, in so many programs. And yet no one has ever phoned to record observing a unicorn or a fairy.
Hold on. I have had someone tell me about a fairy, but I'll tell you about that in a little bit after. You go on, sorry.
But, or witches on broomsticks or demons or anything else. All they've seen are animals. And the majority of my reports come from people that live in the countryside, of course, because if you're living in the city, you're not liable to see much else besides other people and a few pigeons and seagulls and possums and what have you. But if you're in the countryside, you'll obviously see a lot more people, a lot more animals and less people. And there's a big difference between city dwellers and country people. And the majority of the population, of course, are city dwellers, including most of our scientists, and they don't really seem to understand that there's a completely different outlook for the country people compared to the city people. So city people, of course, city people try not to look around because they're constantly in competition with lots of other people, walking along the sidewalk, driving, and anyone that wants to speak to them, usually trying to sell them something. Whereas country people are completely different because they're out in the wide open spaces, and their survival depends on being aware of the natural environment around them. So, of course, I'm talking about farmers and forestry workers and national park rangers.
Yeah, I think you can classify them in two areas, Gary. I think you've got country people, which is like your farmers and the people that live in the country, and I think then you've got your bush people, because I think they're two very, very different depending on the area.
That's right. You have then the besides the farmers, you have all the rural dwellers. So these are people that range everything from professionals that work from home on their country properties, can be houses in the forest or on farms, and then of course people that are into small crops on small properties, hobby farms, hippies, a whole array of different people, but all of them are very aware of their environment because they're always looking at the skies to see what the weather's doing. They're always paying attention to the roads that they're driving on because they're usually rough gravel roads more often than not, and they're off working on their properties or their national park ranges, and so they're working in the forest. They could be loggers, a whole array of different people with different occupations.
Yeah.
And these are the people that report seeing these animals. They're simply another animal that they encounter during their normal day's activities, except they're animals that are extremely rare or extremely difficult to observe, and they're usually only observed on very rare occasions. So the average bush dweller might never see anything at all that's unusual. The well-known native animals, be they kangaroos or emus or koalas or big monitor lizards, goannas or dingoes or what have you. But occasionally they'll encounter an animal that it shouldn't really exist, that's not classified.
Well, I think, Gary, before you go on, if I can simply say, how hard things are to photograph in the bush. I mean, as you know, I spent a long time, what I would call a professional amateur wildlife and landscape photographer. And, people trying to explain, you've got the flash cameras, you've got the flash gear, it'd be so much easier to be able to photograph them. But I draw back to one example, and I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to explain this one example. There's a photo that appeared on Facebook about a year ago of this guy. He photographed this kingfisher. This kingfisher came to this one particular lake every day, and for 6 months he tried to photograph this kingfisher breaking the water as he dove in for a fish, right? How many photos do you think it took him to get that shot?
I would say a minimum of dozens of photographs. Because
3,000.
3,000, yes, there you go.
3,000 tries to get this thing as a dove, and he got the shot, but he had the advantage that he knew where that kingfisher was going to be every afternoon. And I simply say to people, if we knew where these things, and this is why getting quantitative data and surveying the area, and this is what we try to explain to people, that this is why you got to spend a whole couple of years getting data on the area you're working and track the signs. And if you can figure out roughly when they're going to be around, then that's going to increase your chances of a photo capture or data capture. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, definitely. Look, people are very familiar with David Attenborough's wildlife documentaries, and they probably think that David Attenborough, with his film team, go off into the forest, and within a few minutes they've found some wonderful animal that they can film. But the reality is, of course, unless it's something common that lives in the backyard, if it lives in the forest, all of David Attenborough's filming has been preceded by scientific studies that have gone on often for years. This is if you're photographing something that's not all that easy to photograph or film, such as, say, for instance, chimpanzees or gorillas or orangutans.
That's right.
And so researchers spend years in the field. To begin with, they can spend weeks just trying to observe the animals, because obviously most wildlife know that humans are dangerous, and so will quickly depart the area when they're disturbed. And of course, animals living in their natural habitat, just like people living in their homes, people are immediately suspicious when there's unusual sounds in their house, and they immediately think there's an intruder. And so it's the same thing with a wild animal, say a chimpanzee or gorilla. Suddenly there's strange noises and sounds. They immediately know that there's some kind of unusual animal about, possibly a predator. And so they're going to move away. And so researchers have to spend many months at a minimum, and sometimes years, watching these animals and getting them habituated to their presence.
Exactly.
Following them. And then eventually they can bring in a film team that can actually set up, and the researcher will say, okay, the chimpanzees, they pass this particular location at this time of day, and in this location right here, they pick up stones and crush nuts, so we can get a video of a chimpanzee crushing a nut. And
that's right. So they build a hide and they'll wait.
That's exactly right. And so the image that you see on a David Attenborough documentary might run for 5 minutes, but it might have taken 5 years to obtain that film footage.
Exactly. And I'll tell you something else, Gary, too. And I know about 3 photographers that have worked with National Geographic. And sadly, can I tell you that with the exception of some of those really cracking video documentaries, a lot of the still shots, in fact, probably well over half of those still shots you see in the magazines are setups with tame animals.
Yes.
And,
yes.
And they break all kinds of rules, because some of the rules are you don't feed the animals, but they feed them. Some say you set up. But yet scientists, what's an accepted way with scientists is you set up feeding stations. And then you put the cameras and the recording devices in and around the feeding stations in order to be able to capture the behaviour or capture the interaction between the subjects. So realistically, that's the more accepted scientific way of being able to study these creatures. But yeah, you're right. In terms of the patience that it takes for people to be able to get those wildlife shots is phenomenal, like you say. But this is the lack of appreciation people have. That it may only take 5 minutes, but it could take years in the planning. I mean, you look at Night of the Lions. Did you ever see that documentary?
I don't think so, but a perfect example is Jane Goodall and her study of chimpanzees. And to be able to even view the chimpanzees, she had to bring in bunches of bananas and feed them.
Yeah.
And in putting bananas and in waiting days after days for them to be found, and then the animals finally getting habituated enough to not to be too concerned, and then eventually began to take these bananas, and then they allowed Jane Goodall to follow her about. So that's right. That's how scientific studies are undertaken of animals in the wild, in remote forests that are naturally very concerned when people turn up, because the most people that they're experienced with are hunters.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so difficult. And you only have the average person only has to go for a walk in the national park somewhere, and you may see some animals in the picnic area that come down to eat some food. There's leftover scraps, or perhaps they're a grazing animal such as a kangaroo that's happy to graze in the picnic area. But as soon as you move out of the picnic area and into the forest, you'll see virtually nothing and hear nothing. And you may think that there's nothing there because you can't see them or hear them. But once you've moved into the forest, you're in the territories of different animals, and the animals are aware of your presence because they're constantly watching predators, and so they cease all their movement and activity. So we're not talking birds singing in the treetops, but particularly about animals that are walking around on the ground. And then, of course, a great many of the animals, the mammals, are nocturnal. They come out at night. And so to observe something that moves around at night is even more difficult. And so in a David Attenborough documentary, of course, they now have night vision cameras and they can film things in the pitch darkness. And even then, they're only filming animals that are already rather habituated and used to people. But to try to film an animal in its natural habitat, and it is nocturnal and lives in dense forest, is incredibly difficult to film. And of course, so the general complaint from people is that looking at photographs, why are the animals always blurred? Why aren't they clear photographs? Because they're used to taking photographs of people in cities and parks and tourist attractions.
Who will pose for you.
That's right, who will pose for you. But if you and I've always been a photographer. I was a professional photographer many years ago, and to try to photograph wild animals in the bush, in the forest,
on the
is
move,
very difficult because you have lots of trees and shrubs and other plants, and the animal is moving around, and so it's very difficult to be able to focus on the animal if you're manually focusing, and not on the vegetation in front of the animal or behind the animal. And with modern cameras that are automatic focusing, they tend to focus on whatever's the largest thing in front of the
foreground.
Of the camera.
That's right, yeah.
That's right. So the foreground will be clear, and the animal you're trying to photograph will be blurred because it's in the background behind the vegetation. So
and the other thing too, you said the other thing about shooting on auto and even on manual, particularly on manual, is that you're changing light conditions, so you have to be able to change ISOs on the move with the modern cameras.
The animal is usually on the move. It may be stationary for a short period of time, but you've only generally got only a few moments, perhaps seconds, to actually try to get a photograph of it. And because it's moving through vegetation, you can only see it occasionally. Otherwise, you only see parts of the animal. So, of course, it's no problem going to Africa, say, and filming animals out of a car on a grassland where there's nothing between you and the animal but air. But as soon as you move into forests, and it's obviously that some unknown animals are going to live in dense forests. That's why they're unknown. Animals that live out in the open, of course, are very well known, have been well known for thousands of years. But a perfect example is everyone knew about giraffes and elephants and lions and tigers and antelopes and deer and everything, but it was very late in the piece before people actually realised that the rainforests in Africa were full of gorillas. That there was also the okapis, a species of giraffe, living in the rainforest, and those animals were the beginning of cryptozoology, the search for hidden animals, and before the gorillas and okapis and other animals in the rainforest were formally identified. Explorers and researchers spent years following native traditions, native descriptions, and it would only be when they finally, an African hunter is able to bring in a piece of skin or a skull or something that you finally realise that the animal they're talking about it actually exists. And there can be very large numbers of them, but because they're in dense forest, they're almost impossible to see.
Well, let me say this to you. Up until about 15, 20 years ago, thanks for listening to the Australian Yowie Project on YouTube. Don't forget to click the bell for notifications for more crypto content for your listening pleasure.